Testing, testing. Good morning, everybody. It's great to be back. It's so good to see all your smiling faces, to be in this beautiful venue here. Many of you for the first time. I want to welcome all of you to Fall 2022 at SRJC in the Luther Burbank Auditorium. For those who've been with us for a while, welcome back. For those who are new, welcome. Okay, so let's give Can all the new hires who've been here, who are hired after, during COVID, please stand up? Wow. All right, let's give them a SRJC welcome. What a couple of years it's been, you know? And first of all, I just want to thank the college community for its resilience, its commitment to our students, its support of one another. And this has been unprecedented times, but it calls for sort of unprecedented responses. And I couldn't be more proud of the entire college community, but I really want to recognize our classified professionals who cleaned our classrooms, right? Our IT and library folks who got, computers and laptops to our students, and our faculty. Our folks from Distance Ed who busted butt to get you guys trained up in Zoom. I don't know how they did it. Thank you very much. And I also want to thank my cabinet and my so-called senior administrators and my administrative team for all the work they did. And they've been making some really heavy-duty decisions. We still have a lot to decide about and make decisions about going forward. As Lasana Hotep, one of our consultants, has said, we may be over the COVID, but the COVID's not over us, right? So later today, Dr. Sundari Mays, who's been an amazing partner, our public health officer, will be speaking. So please tune in if you want more information about where we are. And as I assure you, we're going to maintain safety and protocols, but we're also shifting into a pandemic to endemic. And what that means, we'll be learning in the next few months. I also want to take this opportunity to introduce two new folks to my senior team, and that's Robert Holcomb, our new Vice President of Academic Affairs. And our new interim Vice President of Student Services, you all know Robert Ethington. And the HR director who's worked with his team in HR to hire more than 250 employees during COVID, Jean Durand. And the person that none of us would be here without, who keeps the paychecks coming and the budget balanced, Kate Jolly. Thank you, Kate. So I just want to say, again, with all the gratification, it's going to be different. Let's lead with kindness and compassion. Let's know that it's a little strange for us to be again together, and for our students. And I'm happy to say that we've bolstered our mental health services. We were able to pass Measure O, which gives a quarter-cent sales tax for mental health and homeless services. And SRJC now receives about $800,000 a year for the next 10 years to support mental health services, which are so important. Yeah. So if you have issues with students or who have mental health issues, please contact Robert Ethington or Bert Epstein, our Director of Mental Health Services. And I forgot to mention Rebecca Norwick and the Student Health Center for vaccinating us and giving us tests all these last few years. Please give them a big round of applause. So all of us have been working double time, overtime. I never signed up to be a public health official, but hey, it comes with the other duties as assigned, in your job description. But I'm really excited about the coming year. It's no secret that all community colleges throughout the nation and the state are experiencing enrollment decline as a result of COVID. I think our single most important priority this semester and this year is let's bring those students back to the campus. We have done an outstanding job of during the COVID. Silver lining is we've been able to accelerate a lot of our capital development projects. If you go to Garcia Hall, the new home of communications, it's state of the art. If you go to athletics, we have redone all of our fields. We have a new Olympic-sized swimming pool, which many of you can swim in soon. And so it's really a great facilities to go with our great faculty and staff. But we really need to do what we can to bring more students back. And it's no one person's responsibility. It's not Michelle Pogian, who does a great job in outreach, to do the outreach team. It's all of us. Talk to your neighbors. Talk to people you see in supermarkets or in restaurants. Students that you think should be our students should come back. So I'm going to really task you and challenge all of you to help us do outreach and bring students here so they can make a better lives for themselves and for their families and for their community. Because I believe without education, their future is not going to be very bright. And I think there's a false narrative out there that college isn't worth it anymore, you know. And somehow we can just figure it out. And this great kind of dropout of students from the workforce, students that should be in your classrooms. We have to rethink how we do things, you know. And this whole Zoom environment, people in the community ask me, when are we going to go back to all live? And my first response is, we were never all live, you know. And our students have changed, and there's still going to be a great amount of conversation about what's the best pedagogy and delivery system for our students. And I think that's to be discussed by our new Academic Senate President, you know, Nancy Persons, who's going to facilitate that conversation with us in administration, because we want to serve students from where they're at, not where we're at. And I think that's the key to bringing students back to SRJC, to maintain our relevancy and the impact that we've had on this community for the last 104 years. So I'm really, really excited about what we're doing. Our commitment to DEI work continues. It's ever going. It's evolving. We've made some tremendous progress, but we have a long way to go. So I invite all of you to participate, I think, next Friday. There's going to be an affinity group reception for everybody, and you get to see the great work that is being done amongst our affinity groups. And I really believe in quoting Harvard, you know, which says, without diversity, there's no excellence, you know, and I really believe that. And we have a long ways to go in that area, but there are many people in this room that are working on those types of important work, and we need to support them. And that's why today we've invited one of the leading experts in this field, in this area, to address us. And it's my honor and pleasure, and please join me in welcoming Tim Wise to speak to us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. So it is weird being back together, right? It's good, so give yourselves another round of applause for pulling that off. But it is weird. If you're like me, the first thing you had to do was make sure that you remembered some of the vital skills that had served you before we went virtual. Skills like remembering how to put on pants, things like that. That was hard because in the era of Zoom, we could just sit around in gym shorts or boxers or whatever and make people think that we were professionals because we'd put on a nice shirt or a blouse or something. And now we have to remember these skills. So it was hard for me to get back in the swing of it, but here I am and here you are. I'm also going to try to remember to keep my head moving right and left to take in all of you, because they say that is a much more polite way to speak. You don't just want to look at one or two people. Of course, the problem is that for the last couple of years, I have pretty much only had to look right here at the little green light on my computer. So if I end up focusing on you all that are right in the middle of this frame, it is not personal. I'm not trying to psych you out or do anything weird. I just have forgotten how to swivel my neck at this point in the process. It is an honor to be here and a great opportunity for us to talk about and continue to talk about, because it's not a new conversation. These issues of equity and diversity and inclusion, these terms that we use, often not necessarily defining them or seeking clarity as to what we mean, but nonetheless talking about them. It's good to be able to do that. It's important to be able to do that, especially in this particular moment, because as you know, and I've been doing this for a long time, about 30 years, about 26 of those traveling around the country, we are in the middle of a pretty intense backlash to the very thought of this conversation. Not just the doing of the work, but even the speaking of the need for the work. And although that backlash has perhaps not been as intense in your state as it has been in others around the country, make no mistake that there are forces nationally and in California that would prefer that all of that work that many of you have done up to this point to increasingly diversify and make more equitable this institution and the larger educational system of our country cease. They would prefer that we not talk about that. In fact, they would prefer that we stop talking about it in K-12, that we stop talking about it in college, that we stop talking about it in the corporate realm, that we stop talking about it altogether. And I would want you to ask yourself a few questions before we get into the substance of what I want to focus on today. The first of which is, why this intense backlash now? Why now? As I said, I've been doing this for 30 years. And this thing they're attacking, which they refer to as critical race theory, but which I beg to remind you they could not define if I were to hold them by their ankles over a bridge and threaten to drop them if they failed to do so. They would all get dropped, and I'm not a violent person. I'm just letting you know who they are. Right? This thing they call critical race theory and that they attack under that name has been around for 40 years. And it's like they just discovered it. And all of a sudden, it has become the boogeyman for some who would prefer that we not talk about issues of equity and racial justice and gender justice and class justice and larger issues of justice in our country. Why now? Why not 40 years ago? Why not 30? Why not 20? And I'm not suggesting there wasn't some backlash earlier. There's always been pushback to change, right? That's not surprising, but it's more intense now. Why? I think we know why. I think we know, if we're paying attention, that something has happened in the last couple of years that for some folks got them a little shook up. Right? 2 years ago, we had the largest racial justice uprising in the history of our country after the murder of George Floyd. 23 million Americans, including millions of white folks who had never really stood up for racial justice before in that way, did so. And you can imagine there would be some people in this country who would be unnerved by that, right? It's one thing for black and brown folk to protest racial injustice. They sort of expect black and brown folk to protest racial injustice. But when millions of white folks, especially young white folks, who maybe aren't as bought into the thinking of their elders as others, join that movement, right? That can be scary to certain people who have an interest in maintaining things the way they are and for whom the existing system has worked pretty well. And so in the wake of that uprising, which changed the narrative in this country, there were those who wanted to shut down that conversation because suddenly phrases like systemic racism were being heard in the mainstream. As I said, I've been doing this work for 30 years. That phrase has rarely been spoken in the past until just the last few years in mainstream media or by mainstream talking heads and politicians. So when all of a sudden those are the words on the lips of millions of Americans, some people get shook up. When suddenly companies and corporations that had never really done substantial DEI work before start to talk about that, even in the C-suites of their buildings and their firms, right? There are those, again, for whom that can be sort of disconcerting, I suppose, because it suggests that something is going to change in the way that they've been doing business up to now. So there's a reason why we're facing this backlash, and that's a big part of it. But then the second question I want you to ask is, what does that backlash then require of us? Those of us who are committed to equity and diversity and inclusion both within our institutional spaces and in the larger country. We must have perseverance and we must have clarity. That would be my answer. Perseverance to continue to push through this backlash in a moment that is, let's be clear, fraught with danger politically, socially, and culturally. This is a frightening time in our country's history around this and many other issues. And if you are not clear on that, you have clearly been hibernating the last 2 years, not just working at home mostly, right? But we also have to be clear. And clarity means not only recognizing some of the bad faith arguments and criticisms coming from some who attack DEI efforts. That's part of it. And as I said, if you're just now attacking this thing that's been around for 40 years, I think you're acting in bad faith. But that's not enough. We can't control, those of us who do this work and care about this, we can't control what other folks say about our work. But we have to be very clear about how we do our work. And we have to do it with clarity and purpose. And I think sometimes we have to be more critical of ourselves in the way that we've done the work. After 30 years, I know some of the things I've done correctly, and I know some of the things I've done badly. And I've seen others of my peers do things well and do things not so well. And so I want to spend our time together talking about how to do this work better, regardless of what those who would not do it at all would say. Because again, we can't control that, but we can control us. We can control the way we speak about these things. We can control the pedagogical approach that we use, whether it's in a classroom, whether it's in a workspace, right? Any of our institutional spaces where we operate. And I fear that sometimes we have made mistakes that sort of qualify as what they would talk about in soccer as an own goal, right? That's where you like kick the ball in your own net and you get real excited until you realize you're on the wrong side of the field and you scored a point for the other team. It happens in basketball too. Nice little layup in the wrong basket, right? We don't want to score own goals. It's bad enough to have to deal with people that would rather roll back the clock on these issues of equity and inclusion. So let's be clear about what we're trying to do and what it is we're trying to change and why. Because I fear that sometimes the approach we've taken amounts to what I can only refer to, and this is the phraseology I use as a Southerner. This is not a scientific term, but it's sort of the y'all suck approach to equity and diversity work, right? Which is the over-personalization of the critique, right? So y'all just suck. That's why things suck, because y'all suck, right? Right? So you have all these biases. You haven't even thought about them, you stupid, awful, sucky person, you. You have these subconscious, implicit biases. By the way, that's true. That research is solid. But if all we do is talk about people's subconscious and implicit biases, and we don't put that in a systemic framework to actually explore where did those come from, then it feels to that person like a personal attack, like I'm calling them bad or stupid or racist or sexist at some deep characterological level. Of course we internalize subconscious bias, race, gender, sexuality, class, physical ability, all of those things, because we've been subjected to stereotypes and imagery. But that's the point. We've been subjected to those things. We have internalized those based on the systems within which we've operated. And I feel like sometimes we don't pay enough attention to the systems that created them. We just jump right to the bias and tell people to get over themselves, which, if you have not noticed in the course of your life, is generally not an effective plan of action for whatever it is you're asking somebody to do. It's like, I have anxiety and depression, y'all. If you come up to me like, why don't you just calm down and cheer up, Tim? Yeah, that shit doesn't work, y'all. Right? Just get over it. Oh, well, I hadn't thought of just calming down when I'm anxious. I'd never thought of cheering up. Looking on the bright side, that's genius. Where'd you come up with that, right? The same is true when we're talking about bias or when we talk about privilege or fragility. Now, make no mistake, privilege is a real thing. And people in dominant groups, not just white folks, but dominant any category, have it, right? In a system of inequality. So yes, white privilege is real, male privilege is real, straight privilege is real, cisgender privilege is real, class privilege is real, able-bodied privilege is real, hearing privilege is real. All of these things are real. But again, sometimes we talk about that in a way that is almost guaranteed to make the person who hears you say that and reads about that think that they're being attacked and critiqued as a bad person. Privilege comes from systems of inequality. And instead of focusing on the system, what we do is we look at people and we say, check your privilege. Oh, once again, that's the settle down anxious person approach to this problem, right? Just cheer up, depressed person. Just check your privilege. And if you would just check your privilege, everything would be fine. But that's not checking the system that created the privilege, or the flip side of the privilege, which is someone else's marginalization. So it seems like we're just beating up on people. Right? And the same is true with the fragility conversation. Do white folks become fragile? Do men become fragile? Do people with money become fragile? Do straight folks become fragile when you talk about the systems of oppression from which we often benefit? Sure, of course. We get defensive, we shut down, we show different signs of fragility because we're not used to having that conversation. But once again, where does that come from? It comes from a system that has never required of us competence in these areas. In fact, it comes from a system that has studiously manipulated all of us into not being better at having these conversations. So if I come through a school system that never requires of me the confrontation with the reality of our systemic injustice as a society, I ought not be surprised when suddenly you bring it to my attention and I get a little pissed. Right? And a little defensive. So what's the real problem? Is it the person who's demonstrating fragility, or is it the system that produced the fragility? Sometimes I feel like we're focused so much on the fragility that the only answer we're offering is stop being fragile. Fill in the blank people, whether it's white folks, straight folks, whatever. Right? And again, telling people to stop being fragile or to check their privilege or to stop being biased is not an action plan. It is a moralizing lecture. It is a judgmental hectoring. It is woke scolding rather than actually changing systems of inequality. And after 30 years, I'm sort of done with that. I'm sort of interested in changing systems of inequality so that we stop producing unearned privilege, so that we stop producing fragility, and so that we stop producing those biases, because as I'm going to demonstrate to you, or at least try, those things are bad for all of us. And they harm all of us. So what we have to do is to be, for lack of a better way to put it, hard on systems and soft on people. That doesn't mean people aren't held accountable for the things they do. But it means that we always try to locate the origins of the things we do that hurt others in the systems that have misshapen us. That is another tactic I learned in therapy, by the way, which my therapist told me that I should tell you that I'm in, because apparently telling folks you're in therapy is therapeutic. So there it is. And in therapy, what you learn, I highly recommend it for all y'all, because even though I reject the all y'all suck approach, I do know that all y'all have damage, and we could all use a little work on our damage. One of the things you learn in the therapeutic setting is that the stuff you do, yes, you must learn to take responsibility for. Yes, you must be accountable for. But part of being able to take responsibility and part of being able to be truly accountable without the shame that shuts us down is to know where the source of your damage lies, right? To understand the source of your behavior. Because if you don't understand the source of it, you'll internalize the blame for the nonsense that you do, right? And you'll just decide you're just a bad, awful person. And once you decide that you're a bad, awful person, you are not likely to do better at whatever it is you're trying to do, because you are convinced you're not capable of it. And maybe you don't deserve better. And maybe those around you are right to think that you're just terrible and awful, so that if that's true about our personal behaviors outside the context of racism and sexism and all these isms, then it's going to be true there also. We need to be clear on where the biases come from, where the prejudices come from, right? Where the systemic injustice, the fragility, whatever it is we're identifying, where it comes from, so that we can actually heal ourselves and the damage that we do to others by bringing that stuff out in the world. Hard on systems and soft on people. The reason it's so critical is that good people can easily find themselves in flawed systems. And those flawed systems can often damage really good people, right? Now, I start with the presumption, and I could be wrong in this, but it's just the only way that I know to live. I start with the presumption that most people are pretty good folks at their core. There are some glaring exceptions to this general rule, by the way. But I think most people are generally pretty good folks who don't wake up wanting to hurt others. And most folks wake up and want to do right by other people. But if you're that person and you find yourself in a flawed system that was created not for the purpose of doing right by everyone, but doing right by some, even at the expense of others, don't be surprised when you find yourself shaped and misshapen by that institutional structure. And education is perhaps the best example of this, the system of education. Because when I talk to people who work in educational systems, whether it's K-12, whether it's colleges, universities, whether it's at the faculty level, the staff level, counselors, whatever, anybody from kindergarten all the way through graduate level education, you often find that the reasons they got into that field in one way, shape, or form is because they fundamentally believe that education, is, as we like to say, the great equalizer. So there's this amazing motivation for getting involved in it. But I will tell you that although I think that is a fine aspirational statement, if you actually believe that that's the function that schools serve, then you aren't paying attention to the institution of which you are a part. Because that has never been the function of education, and indeed it was not the purpose for which it was established. And I know that can be hard to hear, but let's be honest. Because if we don't know the systems that we're in, we're never going to be able to change them. And the system of education from preschool all the way through graduate level education was created for the purpose of inequality, not equality. How do we know? Well, first, we can look at what it produces. We'll just start there and we'll work backward, and then I'll give you some additional evidence. Here's what we know. We know, for instance, that black folks with a college degree are still almost twice as likely as white folks with a college degree to be unemployed, even if they studied the same subject matter, majored in the same subject, etc. Latinx folks with a college degree about 50 to 60% more likely than white folks with a degree to remain unemployed, even when they studied the same subject matter, majored in the same subject, etc. Asian American and Pacific Islanders with a college degree, about 20 to 25% more likely than their white counterparts to remain unemployed, even when they studied the same subject matter. Our indigenous brothers and sisters, 2/3 more likely to remain unemployed, even with a college degree, compared to white folks with a degree, even when that degree is in the same subject. So just at the level of production and outcome, it's pretty obvious education is not equalizing much. So is that the only evidence? No. We also know, for instance, that the typical white family headed by a high school dropout actually has about 25 to 30% more net worth than the typical black family headed by a college graduate. Let me say that one again. A white family headed by a high school dropout in this country, 25 to 30% more net worth on average than the typical black family headed by a college graduate. So once again, right, there seems to be a problem between this promise that education is an equalizer and the reality that it's not actually performing that function. So now working backwards, we have to ask, why is that? If folks are getting their education, they're staying in school, they're doing what we're asking them to do, and there's still these profound disparities, one of two things sort of has to be true. Either number one, Despite our commitment, we are the most incompetent people in the history of history. So we really intend to make this work, but we just haven't figured out how to do it after all these years, in spite of our good intentions and our competence and desires. Or maybe the machinery of which we are a part was never intended to create that nice, friendly, equitable outcome in the first place. And that's a hard one to swallow, because we want to believe that the system was set up for good purposes, but here's how we know it wasn't. The people who set it up told us. They told us what it was for. Now, we haven't learned this history, and if some people have their way, I guess we never will. But let me just share a little of it with you very briefly, because it's important for anyone who finds themselves working in any capacity in an educational institution to know how the gears turn and for what purpose they turn. Because if you want to turn them in a different direction, right, and you want to steer the machinery, so to speak, in a different direction, the first step is understanding why it's moving in the direction it's moving now, so that you can figure out, how to stop that and go somewhere else. So let's go back to sort of the beginning, if you will. And Thomas Jefferson, who was not only a founding father and all that, and a president, he was also a renowned educational thinker in his day. Founder of the University of Virginia, someone to whom people turned for insights about how schooling ought to work in the new nation. And what did Jefferson say the purpose of that education was, or how it should function? Here's what he said. He said, what we need, this is, by the way, in his writing, Notes on the State of Virginia. He says in that writing that what we need is 5 or 6 years of compulsory schooling. And keep in mind, he didn't mean for everyone, right? He wasn't talking about education for black folk or indigenous folk. He wasn't talking about 5 or 6 years of compulsory schooling even for girls and women, right? He was just talking about boys and men who were white and probably from property-owning families, right? He said 5 or 6 years of compulsory education. Why? What was the reason? So that we can, these are his words, not mine, rake a few geniuses from the rubbish. Now, what does that mean? If one of our first educational theorists and a founding father of our country, quote unquote, says that the purpose of education is to rake geniuses from the rubbish, which is, of course, a synonym for trash, what he is telling us is that most people are trash, and he's just talking about the white men. Fascinating. We know how he feels about black and brown folks. We know how he feels about girls and women, right? He's just talking about other white guys. Like, he's looking at other white guys in this new nation, and he's basically saying, yeah, I really don't like y'all either. Most of y'all are garbage. But we're going to give you like 5 years. And after that 5 years, we'll have a couple of y'all will be geniuses, and you'll come run stuff with us, and the rest of y'all will just lift things that we're too precious to have to lift and do the hard labor that we don't want to do. So what he was saying was the purpose of school is not equality, it's inequality. It's not equity, certainly not inclusion, right? It's inequity and exclusion. Now you may think, oh, all right, that's one example, but that's a long time ago. Cool, we'll move forward. Early 1900s, Woodrow Wilson also becomes president of the United States. Before that, he was president of Princeton. And he was also somebody who was really well regarded as an educational thinker. Right? Wasn't quite on the level of Dewey and some of his contemporaries, but he was up there. He was someone that people looked to for advice on the proper role of schooling, the purpose of schooling, the function of schooling. What did Wilson say? He said that what we needed in this country, and particularly at that time of industrialization and large-scale immigration, right? What we needed was one group of people to prepare themselves for the receipt of a liberal education. That was the term they used to use for college. It didn't mean, liberal like liberal versus conservative. That was just the term for college. So he said one group to prepare themselves for that, for the receipt of a liberal education or college education. And he said, what we need is a much larger group, by necessity in this or any society, to forego the privilege of a liberal education or college education and prepare themselves for the performance of certain difficult manual tasks. So what's he saying? It's pretty much the same as Jefferson, right? A little bit longer sentence structure, right? A little more complicated in the way that he's saying it, but fundamentally, it's the same thing. We need a handful of folks to go to college. The rest of y'all are going to lift things that we don't want to lift. You're going to do the heavy labor. We're going to rake geniuses from the rubbish. You see, there's a consistent thread. What Wilson is saying is that even by the 20th century, the purpose of education is not equity, it's not inclusion, certainly not diversity, because Wilson also was not thinking about black folks and brown folks at all in his articulation of who should go to college and who shouldn't. The purpose was inequity. It was exclusion, right? And you might think to yourself, all right, but that's like over 100 years ago too, so surely that's changed. Well, let's see. Let's fast forward to the early 2000s. Now we're in like 2001, either late 2001 or early 2002, but, contemporary history. And the No Child Left Behind law had just passed out of the first year of the George W. Bush administration, and I was watching one of the Sunday talk shows, and they had William Bennett on as a guest. William Bennett, who was the Secretary of Education under Ronald Reagan. He was also the drug czar. He did a bang-up job with both of those, as I'm sure you'll agree. Bill Bennett, who was, until somewhat more recent history, the worst Secretary of Education in the history of the country, but records are made to be broken, so there you have it. Lou Brock once held the stolen base record too, but not anymore. Things change. And Bill Bennett's on the show, and they're asking him, as the former education secretary, they say, Mr. Secretary, what do you think is the most important issue facing American education today? Now, that's a huge question, right? Like, honestly, that's a question for which no soundbite is really going to suffice. If you ask me that on national television, which, surprise, no one ever has, but if you were to ask me that, I would probably ask for like a sip of water. I would ask for a commercial break. Like, give me a minute. I need to think about it. I wasn't ready for this huge question. But Bill Bennett, like he knew they were going to ask it, was completely ready. He didn't take a pause. He didn't swallow. He didn't take a breath. He didn't get water and think about it as he sipped, right? Nothing like that. Bill Bennett had an answer right on the tip of his tongue, and he said it. He said, well, the biggest problem is that too many people are going to college. That's what you came up with? Like, if you had said the problem is college is unaffordable, all right, that's a good one. People are going into huge debt. That would have been, it may not be the best answer, but it's an answer. If you were to say, well, the biggest problem is unequal K-12 funding, which leads to these disparate outcomes, okay, that's acceptable. But you said, William Bennett, former Secretary of Education, that the biggest problem is too many folks have ambition and are going to college. And I thought to myself, now, who is he talking about? Because he didn't say. And they didn't ask. But I would have asked, who are you talking about? Now, let's use some deductive reasoning to figure out who he's talking about. First, we can start with who we know he's not talking about. I don't think he's talking about the rich children and mediocre children of rich and mediocre parents, of whom there are literally millions in this country. I have known a lot of rich and mediocre people, right? Every prep school in America, you go to those boarding schools on the East Coast, or I was just in LA, go to Harvard, Westlake, go to any of the prep schools, the fancy private schools all throughout this area. Someone always graduates last, right? They're not all valedictorians. That's not how valedictorians work. So somebody graduated first, and somebody in that super expensive, smart, rich people school was dead ass last every single year. Every year, somebody barely squeaked through. And they're still going to college. Nobody ever the guidance counselors don't bring them in the week before graduation, sit them down with their parents who just spent however many tens of thousands of dollars each year to send them there, looks them in the eye and says, well, I know you want to go to law school, but I really think you might consider working in a warehouse. No one ever does that because we know who's supposed to work in the warehouse and who's not. Thomas Jefferson told us who it was. Woodrow Wilson told us who it was. And now Bill Bennett is basically doing the same. He's not talking about the rich and mediocre children of rich and mediocre parents. We know they're going to go to college. They're expected to, no matter their grades, no matter how they do or don't apply themselves. Right? But the working class of all colors, and black and brown folks in particular who are increasingly accessing higher education, not as much as would be nice, but more so than in past generations, almost by default that's who he's talking about because that's all that's left. Other folks were already going in large enough percentages. Those are the folks who hadn't been and who now were. So he is talking about the working class. He is talking about people of color. He is talking about the historically marginalized who dare to dream above their historic station. It is the mentality of the slave owner in full view, because what did the slave owner think? The slave owner thought, well, if you teach them all to read, who's going to pick this cotton? And the modern version of that is, if they all go to college, who's going to change the sheets at the hotels and who's going to pick the fruit in the fields, right? And who's going to change the bedpans at the hospitals and who's going to do all that heavy lifting that Thomas Jefferson talked about, because again, we've made a decision that certain work is beneath you if you went to college. Because we've decided to place a value, a moral value on some labor versus other labor, right? So-called brain labor versus physical labor. We've made this artificial distinction so that some of us with degrees, see, we think we're above doing that work. We want other people to do that work for us, and the only way that can happen is if they don't do things like go to college. And so again, what Bill Bennett is saying is the purpose of education, y'all, is not equity. It's inequity. That is its purpose. The reason I spent time on that history, it may seem like an interesting history lesson, but not pertinent to your work. I promise you it is, though, because if you're part of a system that was set up from the beginning to produce inequality, then if you want to be part of something different, if you want to be part of an institution, a junior college district, a particular campus, or a country that's about equity, you have to start with the realization that that commitment is a revolutionary act. And it has to be viewed as such because it pushes against the grain of everything that this society has historically been about. You are a revolutionary the minute that you commit to that. And if you're not prepared to commit to that and to be a revolutionary for equity and justice in the face of that history, not just the last 2 years of backlash, but hundreds of years of history, then this work is probably not for you. So we have to understand why the system produces these outcomes, because if we don't, we will rationalize the outcomes and we will acclimate to those outcomes. So when we talk about, as I did, focusing on the system, what does that mean? It's not just the historical system, it's contemporary practices and policies, right? How do people in this country disproportionately get jobs? Whether that's in the corporate world, whether that's staff positions at colleges, whether that's even in many cases faculty gigs, whether that's working in just about any employment realm. We know the answer to that question. It's not the result of everybody throwing their resume in a big pool and they all get compared and gosh, this is clearly the most qualified person for this position. There was a study published in the New York Times just a few years ago which found that half the jobs in this country are being filled not only through networking, but through one particular form of networking. A form of networking whereby a person already working in an institution writes a letter of reference for a friend or a colleague or a neighbor or somebody they know who wants a job with that institution. and vouches for them and says, you know, my buddy over here would be good. Almost half the jobs being filled in the last 15 years being filled through that kind of networking. Now, that may not sound like a big deal, but what did the study reveal? Who is excluded from those networks and who is included? Right? Who is more likely to know Jim over in the HR department? Who's more likely to know Brett over in accounting or whatever, right? Well, somebody who is sort of like Jim and Brett. And that's not to say Jim and Brett aren't wonderful guys. They could be fantastic, but if who they know and therefore who they can recommend for an opening at their college or at their company or in their high school or nonprofit or whatever kind of organization they work for, if that person knows people mostly like themselves, that's who's going to get those recommendations. That's who's going to be more likely to get those jobs. And it's not going to have anything to do with merit objectively or talent or qualifications. And the research says it is people of color, it is women of all colors, and it's working class white men even, who are often excluded from those word-of-mouth networks. So if we're talking about focusing on the system rather than just the outcome of the system, we have to start to question things like the hiring practices and the policies, some of which are formal, a lot of them are informal. And they are very rarely done with intentionality to injure. I don't think that when Jim writes that letter of recommendation for his friend, that he's thinking to himself, well, if my buddy gets that job, that means a black person won't. That's great. Like, I don't think that's Jim's motivation, right? Or if I give the job, we get the job for this guy, that means a woman won't get it. That's fantastic. I don't think that's what's going on in the head of the person writing that letter. But regardless, a study like that demonstrates that even if there's not a single racist in that hiring unit, in the overt sense of being a racist, even if there's not a single sexist in that hiring unit, in the sense of being an overt sexist, the outcomes are likely to be no different than if half of the people in that hiring unit were racist and sexist. So if the outcomes are what we care about and not just the biased intentionality, then we have to do better and look at that system. But even the jobs that are filled through an objective observation of credentials aren't really objective. That's another part of the system we have to explore, because it too has created inequality, whether it's purposeful or not. Right? So if I'm looking at resumes and I say, well, this person has 10 years of experience, and this person has 7, and this person has 5, so it's obvious who's more qualified. Here's the problem. We live in a society where certain folks have had a 5-lap head start in an 8-lap race. And sometimes those head starts are about race, sometimes they're about sex and gender, other times they're about class status. Other times they might just be about, the luck of knowing certain people who know certain people, and it may or may not be related to those identity categories. But the fact is, if you've had a head start in a race, you should cross the finish line first. That doesn't mean you're necessarily the most qualified person for that next opening, though. We have to be evaluating people's work effort and merit relative to the opportunity structure that they've had. Somebody who starts out 5 laps behind but finishes the race 2 laps behind is by definition the one you want on your track team. Because if I close the gap between the one who was in front and myself, that means I ran faster. That means I exerted more effort. But we live in a winner-take-all society, don't we? Where all we look at is who hits the tape. Which is fine in the Olympics because, all those runners are sort of in a unique class. So it's a relatively fair competition, right? I mean, not everybody out of the 8 or 9 is going to win. We sort of know it's between 3, but they're all faster than you. They're all faster than me, right? They're world-class athletes. It's different, but we're not talking about the Olympics, right? We're talking about, day-to-day life. And that inequality has nothing to do with merit, but we accept it. It's just sort of the way it is. We think it's no big deal. We don't even realize sometimes when we're using criteria that have that effect. I was doing a training during the lockdowns in 2020 with it was an accounting firm in the Bay Area. We're doing a Zoom, and they were lovely people, and I enjoyed my time with them. But it was fascinating when I was on their website, sort of prepping for the call, trying to find out who they are and what they're about. I noticed that one of the things that they had right there on the front of the website was, and for them, this was like a marketing tool, obviously. They said, you know, we want our clients to know that we only hire accountants from the top 4 accountant schools in America. Top 4 accounting schools. And I was sort of confused. First off, like, why 4? Like, that's a weird number. I mean, you know, 3s and 5s and 10s, I get 4. What that tells me is, like, there's some dude working there who went to number 4, and he just wants to make sure that he got in sort of under the wire, right? It's self-interested thing, I think. But what really confused me was, what does that mean? Like, it didn't confuse me, actually. It alarmed me. What does it mean if you tell me you only hire from the top 4 accounting schools? Who does that mean you're probably not going to see? A lot of working class folks who maybe can't afford to go to those institutions. You're going to overlook historically black colleges. You're going to overlook Hispanic serving institutions. You're going to overlook a lot of folks who, by the way, graduated higher up in their accounting class than the folks that went to the top 4, because once again, somebody at Wharton was the last place graduate. I think I might know who it was. Y'all can Google that. Somebody graduated last at Wharton in that class, and yet they still, so you'd rather have them? Like, you would actually rather have the last place graduate at Penn than somebody in the top 10% at a state institution, or who got an accounting degree at a 2-year college and has been working in the field for 5 years? Like, why? Why? Well, because you assume they're better. Well, again, do I think that that company was saying, well, you know, this is a great way to keep this space mostly white and, you know, and upper middle class or affluent? No, but the effect of their decision was to do that, right? And so we had to sort of unpeel what that meant in the course of our time together, because so much of the time, whether it's our education system and how we take for granted what its real function is, even though history says it's not, or whether it's our workplaces where we take for granted how they function, even though the evidence seems to suggest that's not how they function, we become so sort of attuned to and acclimated to these realities that we normalize them. We don't question them. There's one more thing, though. And I think this is the big one. This is the one that for 30 or 40 years, I think a lot of DEI practitioners haven't really been willing to lean into and to talk about. Maybe it seems too difficult or scary to do it, but there's got to be a reason why, in spite of all these years of work and a lot of good people working on these issues, we haven't made the kind of progress that we would expect to make in equity and diversity and inclusion in our institutional spaces. Again, if we're good people and smart people and caring and compassionate, you'd think we would have maybe moved the ball quite a bit further down the field. And I started thinking about why, right? Why is it that with all this intentionality and all, you know, all this genius behind our institutional leaders that want and push for these things, from college presidents to corporate executives with good intentions to teachers in the classroom, with all these people, why is it we still haven't really moved the ball far enough down the field? And I think the big problem is that we haven't addressed the other P. So we talk about people and their biases, their privileges, their fragility. We talk about policy and procedure, old boys networks, things like that I just talked about in the job market. But there's also paradigm, right? Sort of the lens, the frame, the paradigm through which we observe our reality and try to make sense of it, try to understand the reason that things are the way they are. And that may sound abstract. I promise you it's not. When I say that, what I mean is, if you grow up in a society, you see inequality. You can't help but see it. Who lives on this side of town mostly? Who lives on that side of town? Who goes to this school and who goes to that school? Who works in these jobs and who works in those jobs? Who's being taken off to prison on the 6 o'clock news in a perp walk and who's not, even though you know some other folks are committing crimes too, right? We see the inequality with our own eyes, and we see it early. And we want to make sense of it. We don't understand why, because we're not born with a sociological imagination. We're not born with a sense of history. So how do we make sense of what we see? Do we question it or do we accept it? Well, what's the thing that we were all taught, the paradigm of life in this country and in this culture, that you were taught, that I was taught, that every one of us in this room and every other room across this country was taught, either by parents or by teachers or by preachers or by politicians, or maybe we just picked it up because it's in the air of our culture. It's the secular gospel of the nation. If America were a Bible, it would be Genesis 1:1. What is it? It's this idea that in America, anybody can make it if they just try, and wherever you end up is all about your own effort, right? This notion of rugged individualism and meritocracy. By the way, let's just be very clear. No one is a rugged individual. Nobody's even an individual. Humans are social creatures. You were not raised on an island by a porpoise. The only way that you would be a rugged individual is if you had been. And if you were, I don't want to be anywhere near you because you will not have language. You will not know that taboo against, not eating me. So if you, in fact, were raised in such an isolated, rugged, individual way, we all need to be alerted to that fact so we can get the hell out of this room before you do something truly awful. We were all raised in community, in groups, families, cultures, tribes, nations, right? Humans are social. We don't accomplish anything on our own. Anyone who says they're self-made is lying. Nobody makes themselves. But our country tells us that that's what happens, right? Wherever you end up is about you. It's a meritocracy. And here's the problem with that. If you don't learn to critique that and to think about that through a critical lens, what do you think happens when you see inequality? You rationalize it. You think to yourself, well, the reason this institution isn't more equitable, isn't more diverse, isn't more inclusive is because those people are obviously not worthy of being there, because if they were, they'd already be there, right? So that notion of individualism and meritocracy actually makes it easy for us to look at inequality and just shrug. Well, you can't change it. I mean, these poor folks, these working class folks of whatever color, they're there because they just don't want it as badly. These women who aren't as likely to be at the top of the hierarchies, it's obvious, though, they just don't value those jobs the way men do, and they don't value those high salaries the same way, and they just don't want to work as hard. And those black and brown folks, well, it's obvious that something's wrong with them. Their cultures are defective. They don't value education enough or whatever, right? We come up with all kinds of excuses, and it's not because we're awful, racist, sexist, classist people. You don't have to be any of those things if you're raised in a culture that tells you that the people on top are there because they're the best, and the people on the bottom are there because they are the opposite of the best. Then don't be surprised when you internalize that, and then you don't make changes. In fact, not only will you not make changes, when someone suggests we need to, you get defensive, right? Because if I've actually internalized the idea that the way things are is just the way they are because that's fair and just and natural, when someone says we're going to start tinkering with that to make it different in some way, my natural instinctual response is you're going to be lowering the quality of the institution then, right? That almost becomes rational. It becomes totally rational for a person to assume that diversification means the lowering of quality, even if they're not overt bigots, just because they've been led to believe those folks aren't that good, because if they were, they'd already be there. So if you're bringing them in, it's obvious you must be making some special compensation for them, right? Rather than understanding the way that systems and structures kept them out even when they were the most qualified people for something. Even when they were perfectly ready for those opportunities. But if we're not thinking systemically, we're rationalizing the inequality. That paradigm keeps us from making change. And here's why that's so dangerous. It's obvious why it's dangerous for the people at the bottom of the structure. I don't think I probably have to spend any more time on that. If you're on the bottom of the structure and people are rationalizing the fact that you're down there, you're obviously going to be harmed. Let me suggest, though, that this is something every single one of us have to care about. And this is why equity and diversity and inclusion is something that we all have a stake in. It isn't just something for black and brown folk. It's not just something for working class people. It's not just something for women as women, for LGBTQ folk, for disabled folk, for deaf folk, for the folks who were normally excluded. It's not just for them. It's for everyone. Because here's the thing. If you buy into that thinking, that where you end up is all about your own effort, even though at some level you know it's not quite that way, because we all know people, don't we? Like, come on. We all know people that were born on third base, think they hit a triple, never had to work hard a day in their lives. And we also know people that have worked incredibly hard their entire lives and have nothing to show for it. We all know people like this. So we know it's more complicated. But if we continue to buy into that, because that's like American ideology and you can't question it, let me suggest to you it hurts all of us unless you're at the very, very pinnacle. I mean, I guess if you got like billions of dollars, you know, whatever. I'm not talking to you, but I'm guessing you don't. So I think, I think it's safe to say those of us in the room, not billionaires, right? We would be doing something else if we were billionaires. We'd be going to Mars or something. We'd be making self-driving cars that don't self-drive. Whatever. We'd be doing something, right? But if you're not that and you buy into this idea, what happens when you run up against obstacles in your life? What happens to you? What's the psychological effect on you? Not the one who's on the bottom. Let's say you're someone who is white and is male and maybe middle class and maybe straight. All the things that historically have given you certain advantages as they've given me, and suddenly something happens and you get that pink slip because the economy has contracted and the institution can't afford you anymore and the health care is too expensive for them to keep you on the payroll, or maybe you work at a factory and the factory shuts down, or maybe whatever happens, right? The recession hits in 2008, 2009, and millions of people lost their jobs, not just black and brown folk, a lot of white folk, not just poor white folk and working class, but middle class. What happens? What do you do? Where do you put the pain? I would suggest part of where you put it is you internalize the blame, because the voice in the back of your head is telling you there's something wrong with you, because if there weren't, you wouldn't be struggling like this. Right? That notion of rugged individualism is a dagger pointed at the heart of just about every American, because the minute that your life goes south, the minute that things go badly for you and go sideways, is the minute that you have no way to rationalize that other than one of two ways. You can either blame others, and we'll do that, won't we? We'll blame immigrants for taking our jobs, which is a fascinating way of describing it. It's like, did you have the job yet? Because if you didn't have it, it wasn't yours. That's how I look at it. I mean, it's not like the company hired you on Monday and then Wednesday was like, just kidding, we're hiring a Latino guy. Like, that's not what's happening, right? But we say that, so we blame others. We'll blame immigrants, we'll blame black folk, we'll blame whomever, but at some point we end up blaming ourselves, because the voice says where you end up is all about you. Remember, you're a rugged individual, so then you say to yourself, good, I'll just double down. I'll work 60 hours instead of 40. I'll take a side hustle delivering food for Grubhub. I'll get some kind of side gig just to make ends meet, rather than questioning the ideology and the system that has been part of that ideology, even though that might be healthier for you. From 1999 to 2013, there were 500,000 excess deaths in this country among white, non-college educated, working class folks in their 50s. The media called them deaths of despair. It was a huge spike. 500,000 excess deaths, people who died who shouldn't have. You know how they died? From suicide, from opioid addiction, and from heavy drinking, bringing on cirrhosis of the liver. That group was the only group that saw that spike. That spike didn't happen for black folk. It didn't happen for brown folk. It didn't even happen for the poorest of the poor white folk. It happened for this working class group and lower middle class group of non-college educated white folks in their 50s. Why? They weren't the ones suffering the most during that period. If you look at any economic indicator, folks of color were worse off, and yet they weren't the ones committing suicide in those huge numbers, taking opiates in those huge numbers, and drinking themselves to death. It was those white folks who were. Why? I would suggest it has a lot to do with that promise that we made, which only they could believe. See, black and brown folk always knew that promise of meritocracy was a myth. They always knew it was more complicated than that. They always knew you had to put an asterisk at the end of that promise. But if you were white and male and working class, you could actually think, well, if I work really hard, my kids will be better off, and their kids will be better off, and their kids will be better off. Folks of color haven't been able to take that for granted. But white folks could, and when suddenly the economy changes, and now you don't get what they promised you, what do you think happens? you turn to opiates, not just pharmacological ones, but political ones too, right? Because what's an opiate? An opiate is a thing that promises to numb your pain. It doesn't take away your pain, right? If you slip a disc and you need some type of surgery, they'll give you opiates to numb the pain, but you still need the operation. If you have cancer, you might get opiates to deal with the pain, but that doesn't get rid of the cancer problem, right? So we have people who, as a result of buying into this mentality, yeah, as long as it's working for you, it's working for you. As long as things are good, things are good. But the minute that things go bad, that's when all of a sudden the very people who never had to suffer those kinds of systemic setbacks before don't know how to cope with those setbacks. And the ones who were always having to jump over hurdles, they just keep on jumping, because what the hell else are they going to do, right? And so in a way, see, white folks, we should have listened to black and brown folk. Middle class folks should have listened to poor folk. Men should have listened to women. Straight folks should have listened to LGBTQ folk. Able-bodied folks should have listened to the disabled. All the dominant group, we could have learned something. And if we had more equitable and diverse and inclusive institutions, we could learn those things, because we'd understand the breadth of our human and national experience as people in this country, but we didn't have to listen. It's like those folks on the Titanic, man. You know, when the Titanic hit the iceberg, who knew first that the ship was going down? The people on the bottom. Leo DiCaprio, you know, you saw the movie. Leo DiCaprio is in the bottom, and he is down there because he is poor, right? And so he couldn't afford a better ticket. He stowed away or hopped on, or I don't remember exactly how he got on there, right? But he's down at the bottom, and the water is coming in, and the people on the bottom who have no access to the middle decks, and certainly not the promenade where Billy Zane is with Kate Winslet, and they're drinking champagne, eating lobster. He's trying to pick her up. Orchestra's playing pretty music. They've hit an iceberg, y'all, and they just keep playing the music. And the people on the bottom are like, hey, hold up, water. Like, this thing is going down, y'all. Like, it's a big hole. Like, I don't really think we're going to make it. And the people in the top are like, I hear some screaming and some jostling, but I don't know what that means. Let's have more lobster. And they just keep dancing. And then the people in the middle, they can really hear the screams, right? But they're ignoring it too. They don't have lobster, but you know in the middle they had some kind of chicken dish like you get at a banquet. Some guy, they didn't ask him, do you want chicken? They just gave you chicken, because that's what you do at a banquet. So the people in the middle are like, I hear this weird screaming from the pores. I don't know where it's coming from, and I don't know what the problem is. They seem to be suggesting we are taking on water, but I don't believe it. Going to keep doing whatever we in the middle of the Titanic are doing. People on the top are dancing. People in the middle are feeling okay. The people on the bottom know what's coming, and we know what happens, right? The people on the bottom of the structures always know first how unsustainable those structures are. But if we don't have to listen to them, because we don't have to work around them, we don't have to sit in the classrooms with them, we don't have to learn from them, we don't have to actually value their wisdom, we all get hurt. So one of the ironies of this attack on critical race theory is that it ignores one of the biggest insights of critical race theory. Maybe it does that on purpose. One of the biggest insights of critical race theory is the idea that, however much we don't want to admit it, the only times we've really made progress in this country when it comes to moving toward a more equitable society has been in those moments when the interest of black folks, and one would extend that and say folks of color more broadly, happen to dovetail with the interest of the larger society. It hasn't been because white Americans historically woke up and said, oh my gosh, we've been treating people so badly, and had some moral epiphany. There were those who did that, but that wasn't the norm. That wasn't the norm. Rather, it was because there was a commonality of interest that was recognized, what Derek Bell, the father of critical race theory, called interest convergence. So when Lincoln abolishes enslavement, he doesn't do that because he had a necessary anti-racist perspective on people of African descent. He did it to keep the Union together. It was a war tactic, right? When desegregation and the civil rights movement were gaining steam, it wasn't just because white Americans had woken up and said segregation is wrong. They had not said that just a few years before, but what some began to realize was that we were locked in the middle of a propaganda battle with the Soviet Union trying to demonstrate that our way of life was superior at the very moment that all these black and brown nations around the globe were coming out from under colonialism. So you're trying to sell the world on your model. How are you going to sell brown people on your model when you have your foot on the necks of other brown people? Right? So there was an interest in making changes to put on a better face, even if the fundamental underlying structures weren't going to be changed. I know that might sound cynical, but Derek Bell and others who've studied it have demonstrated it. That's not something we ought to necessarily beat ourselves up about, however sad it is that it's taken that, but we should take advantage of it. If, in fact, the thing that moves us forward is a recognition of our common interest, then we have common interest right now. Right? We have common interest in challenging that notion of rugged individualism, which sets us all up for a fall. We have an interest. I mean, I'm looking out. Here we are, and this will be and then I'm done. I promise I'm done, and then I'm going to do an extended thing. If you want to come, we'll chat. But this is really important for everyone to hear. We are 2.5 years into this COVID thing. We still don't really know if it's over. We hope it's over. We're the epicenter of failure on the planet when it comes to this thing. Why? See, that's related to race too. How can I say that? Well, I can say it because of this. The first 2 months of this pandemic, go back and look at the CDC data from March and April. Actually, no, February and March. So it we knew it was out there in February, and then March is when we did the lockdowns. Look at the first 2 months of data. Only 28% to 30% of those who died in those first 2 months were white. Everyone else was of color, disproportionately affecting black and brown folk, right? And when that fact was revealed in the press, and it was on April 7th of 2020, is when it hit the New York Times and hit the Washington Post and became a national story. Up until then, that last half of March, remember, we're in lockdown. Folks were more or less going along. I mean, people were complaining, but more or less, people were going along with it, hoping that it would be over soon. April 7th, the headline talks about how COVID is disproportionately killing black people in particular. And almost immediately, the mood changed. Folks start showing up at state capitals with their camouflage and their AR-15s, demanding the right to open everything back up. I got to go to Buffalo Wild Wings, damn it. I got to go get my hair cut. I want to go back to work. I need to go to Hooters or Olive Garden or whatever the hell. I'm not wearing a mask. What are you, a Nazi? Standing 6 feet away from you at the Trader Joe's, what's next? Concentration camps, like all this anger and hostility about the tyranny of lockdowns, but they weren't saying that prior to April 7th. Some people were grumbling, but no mass demonstrations. Suddenly, as soon as we hear that it's disproportionately killing black folk, white folks show up with guns and camo at the state capitals. And that's who it was disproportionately. Right? Now, what do you think would have happened if that headline had said, wow, it's weird, y'all, but for some reason, white folks are dropping like flies from this COVID thing? Do you think these folks show up and they're like, that's okay, I need a haircut? No. If the headline said it was white folk, they are going to be writing their representatives and senators demanding that they shut everything down and just start sending checks. But see, it was black folk, right? And then later we find out it's Latinx folk and indigenous folk too. So we take our foot off the brakes. And that very night, actually, April 7th, fascinating, that night on Tucker Carlson's show, keep in mind, Tucker Carlson had been the one conservative talk show host who was taking it really seriously for a couple of weeks before April 7th. He was the one every night who said, this is not the flu, this is not a cold, this is serious, take it seriously. And the very night that the headline hits that says it's killing black folks disproportionately, he goes on his top-rated show and says, well, it's obvious the most important thing now is for everyone to get back to work. And Brit Hume was his guest that night, and Brit Hume says, in the wake of this headline, not referencing it because that would have been tacky, but it's the same day, y'all, says, well, maybe this thing turned out to be not as deadly as we thought. For whom? So we take our foot off the brake because now we think it doesn't affect us. See, this is why folks say, until Black Lives Matter, nobody's life will. Right? So we take our foot off the brake, and surprise, surprise, by December of 2020, 55% of the monthly dead are white. By the middle of 2021, 62% of the overall dead are white. Now, almost 64% of the people who have died in this country from COVID have been white. That's what happens when you're indifferent to the suffering of some because it doesn't affect you. Just stick around a minute. because it surely will eventually. There are hundreds of thousands of white folks who have buried our friends and our loved ones because at some point certain people said that's a New York problem and we know what that means. That's a Los Angeles problem and we know what that means. That's a Chicago problem. That's a Detroit problem. That's a New Orleans problem. That's not going to affect us out here in the suburbs, the exurbs, the small towns, the rural communities away from large metropolitan areas, but it did, right? And so at the end of the day, we have to care about equity. We have to care about one another, not as some act of charity. This is not charity work. This is solidarity work. This is not charity work. This is self-help work. This is how we all get free. This is how we all stay alive. And if we don't take it seriously as an act of revolutionary love for one another, we are not going to make it, not as an institution, not as a college district, not as a town or community, and not as a country. Thank you all so much for being here. I appreciate you so much for having me. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, SRJC community. It is really, really, really fantastic to see you all. I'll try not to repeat that 100 more times. I'm Nancy Persons, president of your Academic Senate. First, thank you. First of all, let me thank Tim Wise for his words today. Again, one more time. You can take a deeper dive into the issues with Tim in the session immediately following this one in the Burbank Studio Theater. I'd like to introduce the members of the Academic Senate Exec Committee. If you're here, please stand up. Vice President Monica Okubo, Secretary John Stover, Associate Representative Jessica Bush, At-Large Rep Laura Aspinall, Equity Advocate Byron Reeves, Past President Julie Thompson, and Administrative Assistant Natalia Hayworth. Many thanks to all of you. There are 26 area representatives to the Academic Senate at this college. Current academic senators, could you please stand up if you're here for a second? Thank you. Please be extra kind to these people. They're going to be working really hard this year, especially the first 4 weeks of the semester, and they really need our support. The Exec Committee will be holding a session on getting to know your Academic Senate directly following lunch today in the Doyle Library on the ground floor, so please join us for this hybrid session. Before I move on, I would also like to acknowledge the historical significance of this academic year. It is our first with an ethnic studies department. Dr. Chong stole half my speech, so I'm going to leave a couple things out. It is important to me that they all be recognized and welcomed in addition to all our new faculty. So again, welcome to all of you. Let's face it, these are tough times. We've been in a pandemic, now endemic for almost 3 years. Nobody here is old enough really, even my mother-in-law, to have had any prior experience with such a situation. While we each have had an adverse experience during this time, no one's life has been untouched by it. We're coming up on the 5th anniversary of the Tubbs firestorm. Our anxiety from the uncertainty brought on by the pandemic, as well as from living in what our students so aptly named a climate catastrophe, has brought us to the point of exhaustion. And yet, here we all are, ready to take on a fresh year. All along, this community has been here to support each other. Your Academic Senate has several significant topics to address this year. You can learn more about most of these by attending our session later today or by attending Academic Senate meetings in person or via Zoom. Today, I would like to mention briefly the most pressing of these topics, accreditation. The college received 3 commendations for our response to many recent crises, for continually supporting and fostering student success, and here I'd like to give a special shout out to the classified professionals, faculty and managers in the SRJC libraries and other areas such as IT, distance ed, student health services who work behind the scenes to pivot services and get resources to our students, as well as those on the front lines implementing our mandates. We also receive commendations for constructing affordable, sustainable student housing and for our demonstrated commitment to achieving financial stability. None of these accomplishments would be possible without teamwork across constituencies. Commendations aside, the college is now required to meet 2 requirements in order to retain its accreditation. We must disaggregate and analyze student learning outcome data for student subpopulations, and we must develop a sustainable process for regularly assessing SLOs for all courses and programs, ensuring that syllabi include statements of these SLOs. In a recent presentation, Tim Wise talked about systemic racism and inertia. Today he talked about paradigms and how we frame things. Well, we've been engaging in various degrees of inertia regarding student learning outcomes for many years at this institution. We owe it to our students to fix the accreditation issues before us. Many of you are already committed to this effort. I encourage you to consider, if you're feeling cynical, setting that attitude aside. This cynicism impedes our ability to do right by our students. We can, as a community, solve this problem. We need our administration to support the work of faculty through facilitating our assessment collection and reporting. We need our classified professionals to continue supporting this work, and we as faculty members need to commit to eradicating the inertia that allowed us to arrive at this moment. It's a team effort. We all know we share one common goal here, the education of our students. As a faculty, we need to regularly examine how we teach and be responsive to the evolving society we exist in. We owe it to our students to fix this accreditation issue. Performing regular assessment and disaggregating results may feel uncomfortable, but it can't be as uncomfortable as failing a class. Assessment and reflection give us hope. Everyone is acting with good intentions. We are all working hard in uncertain conditions. Everyone is experiencing anxiety to some degree. Some of us have been isolated, working remotely for years now. Others have never left the campus they work at. The very roles we serve here sometimes cause us to feel we have competing interests and we come into conflict with each other. Years from now, we're going to look back on this time and consider the choices we've made about how to handle this pandemic era. What do we want to see when we reflect on this time? Each of us needs to take a long, slow breath before allowing our frustration to take over our emotions and cause injury to others. In other words, let us please all just take it down a notch. Years ago, I worked for Ben & Jerry's. Every year, the staff designed new t-shirts. My favorite one had a slogan on the back, which was the result of inquiries made to those standing in line to order. Are you alone or together? We asked. We have this choice before us all now. Are we standing alone or together? We should not be talking about personalities nor anecdotes. We should establish processes and systems to assure effective communication with each other. We cannot achieve the change we need without these. Together, we are this institution. After Tubbs, a friend sent me a plaque saying, "Adversity precedes growth." We have a great advantage here. We're a community, and we share a common bond in the form of our students. This moment presents us with new opportunities. Pema Chodron said, as I repeated at a board meeting recently, the present moment is the doorway to liberation. So let's get to work, and I want to thank you for your time. Thank you, and now it is my great pleasure to welcome Debbie Weatherly, President of the Classified Senate, to the stage.
Good morning. First of all, I can't believe 15 years ago I stood on this stage, exactly not this stage because it's all been remodeled, but I did a speech about my mother. My mother now is 85 years old. We moved her out here 2 years ago from Arkansas, and she was in a convalescent home. She had told me on the phone that she felt she was going to die because of the pandemic, and they were so isolated in the convalescent home. So we went out, got an RV, brought her back, and she's been living with us ever since. Now, the thing about my mother, and the reason I shared about her 15 years ago, was that she was raised on a sharecropper's farm with 16 other children. One of the oldest children, she had to pick cotton and take care of the little ones. So she never went to school. Now, when she married my dad, who was a military man, he was able to rescue her from this. But when we would come home from school, we would be so excited to show her what we had learned at school. She was very interested, and we thought, wow, she really likes what we're learning. Unbeknownst to us, that she was learning how to read and write and do simple math from us. Now, the reason I share this is all of you faculty have no idea the impact what you do. You are not only affecting your student, but possibly the people at home. So don't take it for granted. Don't somehow simplify what you do. It is a great thing that you have to do, and it's so appreciated. I appreciate this because now with my mom, 85 years old, I take her the paper every day. She reads it thoroughly, and she will come and comment to me about things that she read. The only reason she knows how to do that is because the teachers we had. So thank you very much. So, thanks. And that was like a commercial because that wasn't in my speech, but I wanted to share that as I was thinking about this place. So good morning. As we come together to welcome the new fall semester, I can't help but think of all the fall semesters that have happened before us and those that will happen after we have departed. Though the players change, the institution should remain the same with the goal of educating and helping others to have the tools to achieve their dreams. One of the many facets of my job duties allows me the privilege of being of service to our retirees and helping to facilitate their paying of health premiums. Now, this is one of my favorite things to do. Not necessarily taking money from retirees, but to be able to connect with not only the classified, faculty, managers, and administrators as well. Many times, it's really like a family reunion. I know about family reunions. I have 14 grandkids, which I am doing my part to increase the enrollment of Santa Rosa Junior College. But let me find my spot. And that's one of the reasons I love to work here. The retirees seem more relaxed and much more chattier now that they're retired, but it's wonderful. This is a gentle reminder to me of the contributions so many have made to our college and the dedication they have shown. Now, you new people, you new faculty, you new hires need to understand this is not just a job. To many of them, this was not just a job, but a passionate calling. They are invested in this place, even now as retirees. And the mission to care about the future of Santa Rosa Junior College. There are very few opportunities in the job market to impact another's life in such a meaningful way as we can with the students we all serve. I do hope we all remember that it's all about the student. I believe that is why someone like Wanda Bynum will choose to continue working in the same institution for 43 years, foregoing her dream to go on to a larger career as she has worked the front line serving our students. And congratulations to her for being chosen Employee of the Month for the month of August, as she was recognized at the most recent board meeting. There are others, though, that deserve some special recognition, and I'm going to repeat some things that have already been said, but I think it's worth repeating. These would be those that were on campus when all others were safely tucked away at home. Our custodians that work hard every evening, keeping our offices and classrooms maintained for us. Can you stand up? Custodians, can you stand? Can you stand? They took on extra projects for the upkeep of our sites. We take this for granted many times. Our groundskeepers that work tirelessly in all types of weather to make sure we have safe walkways and everything looks aesthetic. Our district police, which continued to patrol the perimeter. Our IT department that made sure we were set up to work from home. Our classified that had to set up offices at home with failed Wi-Fi many times, working with barking dogs, which I know, and unexpected children appearing on laps. The notorious Zoom meetings that would sneak up on us. Remember, you're muted, would always be heard. Our faculty that had to do a hard stop and change the way they would be teaching for the next couple of years. It wasn't easy, and I know that. Our managers and administrators that had to make difficult decisions during a pandemic that had never been heard of before this time. And our dear students that really had to adjust and try and succeed in a strange environment. Thank you for all your dedication, your flexibility, and the work ethic that was shown. We all continue to offer our students the best service we can. And while we are a caring campus already, I'm excited to be a part, alongside Vice President Kate Jolly, Interim Vice President Robert Ethington, and Superintendent President Dr. Chong, in bringing the Caring Campus program to our district in the spring. We have our initial meeting next week with Ken Sherwood, who's the Vice President of Caring Campus, that works in conjunction with Institute for Evidence-Based Change. Classified Senate has also been working hard to advocate for this program that will enrich student services across the district. We have also been continuing to work for a 9+1 and will adopt the statewide 4CS Senate 9+1 when it is presented in January. We also are doing a reset in our own classified Senate to make the most of what we have and to work smarter. In closing, I am very grateful to all my coworkers and colleagues that made all the adjustments doable. I really look forward to what the next semester will bring to us. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce George Sela, who will introduce the Multicultural Educator Award to our very deserving classified senator herself, Regina Meharry. Thank you very much.
Good morning. It is a pleasure to be back on campus and to be in Burbank Auditorium. I haven't been in here for about, I think, 4 or 5 years. So it gives me great joy to be in this building today, and more importantly, to celebrate somebody or to celebrate something that is really rare on this campus, which is to celebrate the folks who, as Tim Weiss mentioned earlier, who we don't recognize, who make our jobs easier as faculty on this campus. As a faculty member, one of a few black faculty on this campus, it gives me great joy to be here today to celebrate a classified professional who happens to be an African American. I have a speech, but as you know me, I might go to church as the Spirit leads me. So I'm going to do my best to keep it under 5 minutes. It brings me great joy and really special honor to introduce this year's Multicultural Educator of the Year. This year's awardee is an outstanding and innovative educator, someone who has challenged so many of us in this room to be better educators. She truly embodies the spirit of this award. She is, passionate. She's a coach for a lot of our students. She's a mentor for so many of them, and her education and her lived experiences really transcend so many intersectional identities. And I think that's really her superpower, that it enables her to understand faculty, understand classified professionals, understand most of our students. And I think that's really one of her strengths. So we are really fortunate to have her on this campus. I enjoy working with her because of the multiple perspectives and the passion that she brings to holistic student support and building community across this campus. You can call her at any time of the day and say, we have a student who needs a place to sleep tonight, and she is on it, calling motels, calling places. We have a student who doesn't have food to eat today. She is on it, getting them vouchers to get food, when most of us in this room may be sleeping. I think we're fortunate to have her on this campus. So for me, it gives me so much joy and happiness that I'm getting emotional. And I'm honored, at loss of words, to present Santa Rosa Junior College, the coordinator of the Sawabona Student Center, the co-coordinator of Emoja, one of the founding members of BLAC. Those of you who don't know what that is the Association for Black Faculty and Staff, which was founded last year. And she also serves as the co-chair with me for that organization. And she is also my sister. So Santa Rosa Junior College, I present to you, my sister, the 2022 Multicultural Educator of the Year, Miss Regina Mahiri.
Thank you. Thank you all. Can you hear me okay? I think this is a height-challenged podium. Okay. Good morning. What's up, y'all? Thank you to the committee for selecting me as this year's recipient for the Multicultural Educator Award. Growing up, I just knew I was going to have my own business. I was instinctual, and I was great at creating things. I had vision, so I could see a finished product before it was even fully conceptualized. As I got older, I discovered that I was good at working with youth. Young people gravitated to me. And I like to think it's because I look like I'm in my 20s. But I know it's more because I give the energy and the attention and the consideration to them that I wanted as a young person. I see our students in their finished state. If I'm being honest, receiving this award is a little bittersweet for me. While recognition for any work that I do is greatly appreciated, it's hard for me personally to receive recognition for anything that is a part of what I should be doing. Doing what is right, doing what is necessary, doing what allows for equitable outcomes and systemic changes, doing what is inclusive, doing what is anti-racist, anti-ableist, anti-homophobic, anti-ism, period, is what we all should be doing. So I share with... So I share with and dedicate this award to those who are doing what's incumbent upon all of us to do. We will use the spirit of this award to remind us on those tough days, on the days where we feel like the needle is not moving, on the days where students are crying in our offices, on the days where bureaucracy and institutional processes seem to lack momentum, on the days where we are mentally exhausted, on the days where we question and challenge responsibility and purview, on the days where transparency seems all but existent, the days where we're made to feel small, the days where being a Black or other marginalized person and body at a PDA just feels like too much. We'll use the spirit of this award as another motivator to keep us grounded in the fact that shift happens, and we are shifters, we are dismantlers, we are groundbreakers and soil fillers working to get beyond the concrete so that our roses can bloom and thrive without the interference of weeds. The time is now. The time is now for us to have vision, to create and redefine and reshape the community college system, our community college system, into one that is not just a community college, but rather a college of and for community. I can see the finished product. Can you see it? We have work to do. To my posse, my think partners, my folks, my chosen family, thank you for your courage and willingness to stand in places where the ground is not always firm. Thank you for challenging me. Thank you for supporting me and having my back. Most importantly, thank you for showing me you love me by embracing me in my fullest and truest self. To my baby loves, Yana and BJ, you are my sunshine and moonlight in spaces that feel dark. You are my inspiration and my encouragement. You're my examples of love and grace. You make me want to be and do better always. You are the ones to carry the mantle forward and do greater than I ever will, and my whole heart smiles because of you. And finally, to those of you that have sent me emails congratulating me and thanking me and congratulating me in person, thank you so much. It is greatly appreciated, and we have work to do. Thank you.
Good morning, SRJC. On behalf of the Professional Development Committee, I would like to thank Tim Wise for an inspiring and enlightening presentation this morning. Also, congratulations to my colleague, Ms. Regina Mahiri, today. So we have some exciting workshops for you today, almost 40, offered mostly internally from our college community, mostly in person. The PDA event schedule page has been emailed to DL staff all. We also have QR codes in the lobby if you want to do a quick scan to that page. And just to give you a glimpse of what's coming soon this month to implement some of the systemic changes that Tim shared with us today, Dr. Chong mentioned that our employee affinity groups are hosting a new employee welcome reception. Again, mark your calendars, next Friday, August 19th, 1 to 3 p.m., Burbank Outdoor Stage Area. Refreshments will be served, and this is an opportunity for you to join us in creating a sense of belonging for our new colleagues, and also in reconnecting as a community. I hope to see you there. We're also implementing a Courageous Leaders Academy. This is a very exciting opportunity for SRJC employees who are committed to DEIA action steps to get some leadership development skills and then to put those skills to work through academy projects. So more information to be shared soon through DL staff all. Deadline to apply is August 26th. With that, complimentary lunch refreshments today, 11:50 Burbank Outdoor Stage Area. Hope to see y'all there and have an excellent PDA day. Thank you.